So this is a resource on the End of Life Doula UK website, and it's in tandem with the slides that you'll find there about how to make a presentation about what it means to be an end of life doula. Next slide, please. So what we usually do to start off is to introduce ourselves. And today you'll be seeing both myself, I'm Judy Knox, and my colleague Emma Clare. I'm a committee member of End of Life Doula UK and a practicing doula. Emma is our chair and is very active in many different forums in a doula capacity. The presentation is usually approximately 20 minutes, and then we allow some time for questions and answers. And also at the end, we make sure that there are contact details of how people can contact us and that they know the web address for the website. Thanks, Emma. So why end-of-life doulas? Why are we needed within society? I think with the advent of the NHS in 1948, death has somehow moved behind closed doors and become very medicalised. And the knowledge and skills that used to be within our local communities have somehow been lost. We all know that our health and social care systems are extremely overstretched. Resources are very tight, few and far between. The pandemic certainly exhibited that to all of us. And people have begun to look to their own communities again to care for their own at end of life. There is an increased focus on the quality of life right up until the end of death, and the quality of death as well, how people in an ideal world, if you like, think that they would like to see their death being. Thanks, Emma.
So I think it's really important when we're doing these talks that we acknowledge that the concept of our work is not new. People have probably been turning to each other in their communities for advice about life transitions, speaking to people who've been through experiences before, looking for support. And people have been doing the work of end-of-life doulas probably since human communities began, but without the title. So we don't want to, when we're doing these talks or the role, come in and pretend that we've kind of invented this and not acknowledge that other communities have been doing this. And indeed, other cultures may not need end-of-life doulas because they may do death and dying very well already. The next thing that I think it's really important to do when we're giving these talks is to sort of anticipate any myths that people in your audience might hold. And I think one of those is that people can assume that we only do the sort of softer side of doulaing, the still very essential and core part of our role, the holding space, the sitting with, the holding vigil, of course, very important. But I think particularly if we're speaking to health and social care professionals, they can minimise our role in that way and not appreciate that we actually do a lot of proactive work. We actually strongly advocate for people a lot of the time. We do a lot of planning ahead with people. So I like to kind of get that out in the room early so that people might start listening more at the beginning of the talk if you mention that. Another common misconception is that if you imagine kind of a scale with community holistic support at one side and medical support at the other, people can imagine that we're almost anti-medical at the opposite end of the scale, when actually all that we do and our role aims to complement other support that a person is receiving. Obviously, a lot of that is medical support. We're not there to replace other roles and services. We're there to essentially fill gaps in the support that people already have. And that includes palliative care. So people can think that they maybe don't need end-of-life doula support if they already have palliative care in place. Of course, that is sometimes true if they already have all the support they need. But we often complement that, and we don't need to be instead of palliative care. And also to acknowledge that many end-of-life doulas have indeed come from previous NHS roles or nursing roles, palliative care roles. So whilst as an end-of-life doula, we're not working in those roles, we're certainly not working in a medical role, we're bringing that knowledge of what other services do to enable us to work alongside those services. And this final point on this slide is one that comes up a lot. People can ask us to really condense down our role into sort of a sentence or two. And I think it's quite important that we push back against that and say, look, if we narrow down our role too much, we actually lose what makes us unique. The whole point of our role is that the support looks different depending on every person we're supporting, because of course they as an individual are different, we as individual doulas are different too, and everybody's going to have different gaps in their existing support. So sometimes our work is entirely practical, sometimes it is entirely emotional support, usually it's a mix of the two, sometimes spiritual support if that is something that the doula themselves offers. So in terms of what we do, there's quite a lot of information on this slide, so I would generally avoid just reading through this if I was doing a talk, but it is to give an idea of the range of things that we can do as end-of-life doulas, and also to mention that not all end-of-life doulas do all of these things. Some of us might focus on specific areas such as advanced planning, but key points to get across here are that we don't only work in people's homes, we can also and do also support people wherever they are, if that is in a hospice or a care home or in hospital. And we can guide people through the decisions and choices that need to be made. So often people might have received information from healthcare services, from their GP, from consultants, but there's that gap after they leave those appointments where they're left to kind of process that information, and there's decisions to be made that we can help them explore their choices, or maybe think about what questions they might like to go back and ask their healthcare professionals. As I said before, we always advocate for people once we know what their wishes and preferences are, and sometimes that can be quite a strong role. You know, sometimes we really have to shout loudly for a person if maybe they don't have friends or family to advocate for them, so we as the doula end up stepping into that role. We can act as a point of contact for other services. So often a person or those close to them could have many different services coming into a home. That can be quite overwhelming at that time. They might not know the difference between those services and what everybody is there to do. So we can take some of that strain away by being a point of contact and helping to coordinate when other people are visiting the home in particular. A core part of our training, as you will know, is that we should understand our local systems around us in our community. So knowing what services are available to people, at what point is appropriate for them to get involved, and helping people to navigate through those systems, which can be really confusing at the best of times. Even when we've been professionals ourselves, it can still be very difficult. So supporting people to do that. We can offer practical support. So these can sound like quite minor things, but actually they all add up. And by helping with these small practical tasks, we can allow the person to spend a lot more quality time with those they love. It might be that as they approach the end of life, they have a limited pot of energy, if you like, that they can only spend on certain things. And by doing these essential tasks, we can allow them to spend that energy on what really matters to them in the last few weeks and days. We offer additional training for doulas that want to offer advanced planning support. So that is a core part of what we do. When we're having these conversations with people, it is really natural for it to come up in conversation what the person would and would not want around their end of life, and we can help people to document that and make it legally binding in some cases. We can simply, as we say, hold the space and take time to sit with the person, to explore any fears they might have around dying with a neutral person, if maybe they don't feel able to say that to their family or friends. Have these conversations with people. I think it's really important that we get across this message that we don't go in sort of, we're not led by form filling, we're not led by a strict remit around a role, we're about conversations and relationships with the person. And a final thing to make sure we mention is that we don't only support the person who is at the end of life, we support those around them, the people that are important to them, and we don't have to disappear at the time of death. We can stay with those people and assist them with things like funeral planning after the death as well. And then just to give an idea to the audience that you're speaking to, that the role we do is broader than the one-to-one support that we've just been describing. So many end-of-life doulas are very active in their communities, and that can look like all sorts of different projects and ways of being in our communities, depending on the doula themselves and what they're interested in. So one of the main examples is that we often run death cafes. So you can talk to your audience a little. I wouldn't go off on a massive tangent around that because that's not the purpose of this talk, but just to highlight that we create spaces in communities for people to come and talk about death and dying if they want to. We can also offer workshops. So sometimes that is to services such as hospices or care homes, but it might also be that we put those on in the community for members of the public to come along and learn, for example, how to do their own advanced planning. We also link in with and support existing community and voluntary groups. So we might work alongside others, for example, in local libraries is a common example. And we also get involved in organising events and festivals sometimes around death and dying. So Pushing Up Daisies is on this slide as a really good example of one of those, which is worth looking up if you want to speak about that at an event you're running. Essentially a way of bringing people of all ages together in the community to feel able to talk about death and dying, not just talk about death and dying, but also explore that in other ways, such as creative ways together as a community.
So this is a lovely film that's actually made by one of our doulas who's also a filmmaker, Rebecca. And I would highly recommend you, if you don't know it, have a look at it on YouTube. And it's a really useful one to use in a presentation, depending upon the audience to whom you're presenting. But I've used it quite a lot and it usually goes down very, very well. Thanks, Emma.
And this is another slide where we're sort of heading off questions that people might have. Of course, we're going to allow time at the end for people to ask questions, but a lot of the questions we receive are usually around, okay, by this point in the talk, you've hopefully got people's interest. They might be thinking of somebody they know that could benefit from doula support, and they want to know how it works. How do they go about getting support from an end-of-life doula? So the first thing we want to get across is that we are a credible organisation. We have quality assured training that our members have completed or are in the process of completing if we're end-of-life doula in training, which is important to let people know. All of our practicing members are DBS checked and are mentored by another doula. And we think it's really important that people have somebody to talk to outside of the conversation and to support themselves as well. Are insured and are following our safeguarding procedures. So I think that's particularly important to mention if you are talking to a health and social care service. And we also have patrons that people in your audience may well have heard of that can give us credibility too. So one of those in particular, Dr. Catherine Mannix, who's a palliative care consultant, many particularly medical professionals will have heard of her. So that's a name you can certainly use to support the message you're getting across. So in terms of how it works, people can refer to us and seek end-of-life doula support through our website. That's probably the easiest way to do it, or they can phone us. Our phone line is available 24 hours a day, and it might sometimes be that the person themselves contacts us, sometimes it's their family or friends, but also health and social care professionals and other third sector organisations, charities. Sometimes we receive referrals from Macmillan and Marie Curie, so anybody can refer to us essentially through those two ways. And then we are very careful to match a person that's seeking support with an end-of-life doula who is local to them. Of course, sometimes we have to acknowledge we might not have an end-of-life doula available in their area, but often we do, and particularly if there's more than one doula available, we will carefully think and ask relevant questions with the person looking for support so that we can match them with somebody who is a good fit to what they're looking for. People might have questions around whether end-of-life doulas are employed by the organisation, so it's important to make it clear that our members are self-employed but are mentored, so have that support. They're not sort of out working on their own. And very important to get across is that ability to pay for an end-of-life doula is not a barrier to access and support. So people might understandably have another misconception here that end-of-life doula support is somewhat of a luxury service, and that can be influenced by the fact that many people might not have heard of end-of-life doulas but might have heard of birth doulas, and birth doulas can often charge a relatively high amount for sort of a package of support. So what we want to get across is that if the person can pay, that's great. If the person can only pay some of the end-of-life doula's fee, then we as an organisation will subsidise the rest. And if a person can't afford to pay at all, then we will entirely subsidise the support on a case-by-case basis. So that's a discussion we would have with the person.
So when we're presenting, it's nice to give examples of type of people that we support. And of course, that support can be either short-term or long-term. And if you can, it's good to try and pick examples that might be appropriate to who you're presenting to. So it could be that you're presenting, as Emma said, to healthcare professionals, and there might be more apt stories to use than others. And it allows people to actually have a little bit more of a picture of the way in which we're able to support people. So, for example, on the right, actually, the picture here, that was one of our doulas, Sam, who supported Barbara Bird, and a filmmaker called Barry Gibb made a film of their work together, which was out, I think, at some time in 2022, and was a really valuable film to watch. I went and saw it in the cinema, but it gives an example of how Barbara was very happily married. She then had a terminal diagnosis and felt that she needed someone for herself. There were things she wanted to talk about that she didn't feel comfortable talking about to her husband for various different reasons. And so she sought the support of a doula, and Sam worked with her until her death. And it was a beautiful relationship. And I think that's often the case, that when someone is given a terminal diagnosis, even if they are very close to their family and friends, there are certain things, almost as an element of protection for those around you that you love, that you don't want to discuss, or perhaps you feel you can't discuss. And as doulas, we're there for anything and everything that somebody wants to talk about or not to talk about. It's, as you know, we're entirely client-led. So it's quite useful to be able to use examples. Emma, I don't know whether you want to come in and add anything on that.
Yeah, I think, or definitely, like you've said, I would make sure I tailored the story that I was telling to the audience. Of course, the example you've given there, Judy, with it being Barbara Bird and having the film made is certainly one where Barbara was happy for us to share her story. But of course, if you're giving a talk, you need to make sure any stories that you're sharing, you either got permission of the person or you're heavily anonymizing the story that you're sharing. And on this slide, it says about short and long term. So you might want to give an example of a way that we can support people over a relatively short period, but also over the long term, because it's good to let people know that it isn't just at the very end of life that an end-of-life doula can be involved. Often people contact us when they're fit and well, and maybe they want to plan ahead and form that relationship ahead of time, so they have somebody to advocate for them down the line.
Thanks. And again, if we can, or if you can, when you're presenting, perhaps share relevant examples of working with somebody in their own home, or hospice at home, or in a hospice, or in a hospital. I know several doulas have worked both in hospices and in hospitals, and it's good if you have got an example of that, again, totally anonymized, but just to give, I think, to give a flavour of the fact that we work alongside medical professionals and medical teams. We're not trying to replace anything that they do, but rather be an extra resource for them, especially when they're very pushed for time. We can really help them. And I think it's important, if we can, to get that across. So an example of that would be really helpful to give.
Yeah, I agree. And this second photo on this slide is has a question mark. So this one is a picture you might want to replace with something that better represents the audience that you're talking to. So if you download this template, you can replace that picture with one that's a better fit for your audience.
Actually, and I would just say at this point, remember this is a template, right? So this is examples of the way in which we make presentations. So you can tailor it to how you want to present. So you can add, you can take stuff out. It's really just a guide for you to start you off in terms of making a presentation. So don't feel that you have to absolutely use these slides as they are to present to whomever you're talking to. It's not that at all, but it's a guide for you, and you can use it as you want. So how I tend to end up is that I say, so the key messages for people to understand about this are the myth busting. So as Emma said, I think there are certain preconceived ideas about what we do. And it's really important that people understand our role is so diverse. We're not just there at the end of life. We don't just sit vigil by the bed. Our ethos is all about compassionate communities. And we, as I've said, we work alongside joined up care, and the person at the centre of all this is our client. And so we draw from their circle of support and help that circle. So we're a support to that circle of support. And the best examples of our work definitely have been possible because of the collaboration between end-of-life doulas and mainstream health and social care services. And I'm going to ask Emma in a minute to talk about a particular project she's been involved with in the north of England. And that is that end-of-life doulas have been working alongside Leeds healthcare professionals, and it has been working incredibly well. But if we can work alongside hospitals or perhaps GP surgeries, that gets our name out there. And it also means that those in the medical profession actually can see how we can be a help to them. So Emma, if you just want to say a few words about Leeds.
Yeah, I think that's so true. So we've been very careful in Leeds not to lose our way of working. I think that there's always a risk of that when we do get closely involved with mainstream health and social care services. But personally, I think that if we want to support people, if we want to offer this support to the people who need it, often those people are in these places. They're often in hospital. Sometimes they're stuck in hospital. They might be in care homes. So getting that message across to who you're speaking to, that we have a role to play. We can see that person wherever they are. We can work alongside healthcare professionals. You can also use some of the great feedback we have on the website from those professionals who've, for example, hospice staff, where they've said that it's been a great help to them to have an end-of-life doula involved. So, for example, hospice staff hearing that from other hospice staff might be more powerful than us just saying that ourselves. So I think the point of that aspect of this slide is to get across that by doing these talks, and there's quite a fitting place to say to the people you're speaking to, thank you for inviting me to do this talk, because this is where that we can really have an impact when we collaborate and work together with the people that you're speaking to. And I think that the point at the bottom, as Judy said, this is a template, and that's where you would edit this slide and give an example specifically that is relevant to who you're speaking to. So if I was speaking to GPs, for example, I might say, highlight the Leeds product, as Judy said, and say that there we have been commissioned by the NHS, so that the doula support is funded through the NHS. People don't have to pay for the service. And we're working very closely with GPs who are obviously in a great position to identify ahead of time people that might benefit from end-of-life doula support and make those referrals to us early. For things like advanced planning, but we're also working closely with the local hospitals who, for example, can contact us if they have somebody who is being discharged from hospital back home at the end of life, but who maybe doesn't have any friends or family and would be alone at home, so that we can step in to support them to die at home in line with their wishes. So as Judy said, this presentation is very much a template. It's a starting point. It's a guide. You can tailor it how you want. In fact, I definitely would recommend that you tailor it to who you're speaking to, whether that's members of the public or a specific service. If you need any help to do that, please let us know. We're very much here. And it might be that you want to buddy up with somebody in your region. So particularly around sharing examples of stories, it might be that you have experience of supporting people as a doula. It might be that you have experience of running a death cafe, but somebody else in your region has other examples to share. So buddying up is definitely recommended, and also means that you can both get experience of delivering these talks. And definitely feel you can come back to us if you want specific examples which might be useful to get your message across. So if you need information about, for example, the Leeds project, or figures of how many people we have supported in the past year, for example, or in your region, then do let me know. You can email the operations email address and I'll get those figures to you so that you can put them into your presentation. So we always end with a slide for questions. If you're doing a talk, definitely would recommend leaving at least 5 minutes, because I think certainly in my experience, there are always questions. And that's really good. It's a good thing that people are interested in and asking. So a couple of what I would call frequently asked questions, and there will be a frequently asked questions document on the members area as well for you to read ahead of time, to maybe give you some guidance on how to answer those. But I'd say 2 questions that really frequently come up are around how much doulas cost. So we already covered that earlier in the talk, so getting across that message that ability to pay is not a barrier. And the second one is that particularly if you're speaking to a service such as a hospice, where they have a team maybe of volunteers, you can often get questions around, you know, this sounds really good, but how is your role as an end-of-life doula different to what we offer as X kind of role? So I would usually answer that by saying something along the lines of, we recognise that many of the things that we do as end-of-life doulas overlap with other roles. But what we do have is the luxury of time to spend with people, to build a relationship with people, to really get to know what matters to them. I think it's quite good to acknowledge that often health and social care professionals working with a person can see what needs to be done, but they just don't have time to do it themselves. And that's where it can be quite reassuring for them as well to have an end-of-life doula involved who can pick up that conversation, who can support them in those gaps between their interactions with their healthcare professional. So I think for those questions, we don't, you know, pretend that we absolutely don't give the impression that we're replacing any services, but we do acknowledge that often the people you're speaking to can see that these things need doing and would actually like to provide the support themselves if they could, but we as end-of-life doulas can do that. So that is all of our template. Did you want to add anything at the end, Judy?
I don't think so, apart from saying if you're asked to give a talk, go for it. The more we can get our message out there, the better. Don't be nervous. As Emma said, you can contact us with any questions beforehand, but definitely go for it. So good luck.
Well said. Thank you for watching, everybody.